It was a quiet, unassuming day when the FBI received a call that would lead them down a path they never could have anticipated. You've probably heard of agents investigating dangerous criminals, solving high-profile cases, or cracking down on elaborate conspiracies, but this was different. This time, the situation didn't involve the typical suspects. There was no human mastermind behind it. Instead, the FBI agents were faced with a much more unusual and pressing case: a dog. Yes, a dog, but not just any dog. This particular dog had been spotted acting strangely, barking desperately at anything that moved, as if it was trying to tell someone something important. But when the agents arrived, it wasn't just the barking that sent shivers down their spines. It was the way the dog behaved when they tried to get closer. The dog wasn't afraid. In fact, it seemed to be guiding them. As the agents approached, the dog froze. Its eyes locked onto them, its body tense, as if it knew they were about to uncover something terrifying. The closer they got to the source of its frantic behavior, the more unsettling the situation became. There was a chill in the air, something ominous in the silence that followed. It was as if the dog had been waiting for them all along, waiting for the right moment to lead them to something they weren't prepared to face. And what exactly was that something? Well, it wasn't a regular day on the job. What the agents discovered would leave them questioning everything they thought they knew about this seemingly innocuous case. They were about to uncover a hidden truth, a mystery tied to something far more sinister than they could have imagined. But the story doesn't end there. You might be thinking, what could possibly be so chilling that the FBI would freeze in place, unsure what to do next? What would make hardened professionals hesitate and question their next move? You're about to find out, but not just yet. Hold on, because this tale is far from over. In the next part, we'll dive deeper into the heart of the mystery and uncover the unexpected twists that will change everything for these FBI agents. Stay tuned, things are about to get even stranger. As the agents stood frozen in place, the dog's unblinking gaze remained fixed on them. It wasn't just the stillness that unsettled them. It was the intensity, the quiet urgency in the dog's eyes. A feeling of unease crept over the group. The air seemed to thicken, every breath becoming harder to take, as if the atmosphere itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. Agent Claire Williams, the senior officer in the group, had been with the FBI for over a decade. She'd seen her fair share of bizarre situations, but nothing quite like this. She was used to criminals, not animals, leading her toward a mystery. The dog, a large German shepherd, was unusually calm, its posture unnaturally stiff. It wasn't the behavior of a typical stray, or even one simply looking for attention. No, there was something different about it, something almost human in the way it seemed to communicate. Agent Marcus Hayes, Claire's partner, leaned forward, but Claire quickly gestured for him to stop. "Wait," she whispered. "Don't move. Something's not right." The dog's hackles were raised, its body poised as if it were ready to spring into action. The agents had been on many wild chases before, but this was different. The urgency in the dog's eyes sent a jolt through Claire's chest. She knew they were in uncharted territory now. "Do you see that?" Marcus asked, his voice low, almost in disbelief. Claire followed his gaze. Behind the dog, just beyond a small grove of trees, there was an old, dilapidated house. It was the kind of place people usually stayed away from. Rotting wood, broken windows, overgrown weeds crawling up its walls. From the outside, it looked like it had been abandoned for years, if not decades. But something about the way the dog had acted, the way it was now standing guard in front of the house, made Claire uneasy. It was as if it were protecting something or someone inside. Claire wasn't sure what it was about the house that made her skin crawl, but she could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up. Something about the air around it felt wrong. She glanced at the other agents. Their faces were pale, their nerves fraying just as quickly as her own. None of them had any idea what was going on, but they all knew one thing. They weren't just dealing with a stray dog. This was something else entirely. The dog took a cautious step forward, then turned and began walking toward the house, glancing back to make sure the agents were following. Claire swallowed hard. Was it trying to lead them somewhere? Had it found something that needed their attention? The agents exchanged tense looks. Claire was the first to speak. We need to follow it. But stay alert. I don't trust this. With guns drawn and their senses on high alert, they cautiously followed the dog, keeping a safe distance as it led them toward the house. The ground beneath their boots crunched with every step, the silence hanging heavily between them. As they neared the house, the sense of dread intensified. The wind had picked up, swirling around them in unnatural gusts, as if something unseen were moving in the air. The dog didn't hesitate, moving confidently toward the front door of the house, which hung ajar. Its low growl vibrated through the stillness of the air, a sound that seemed to reverberate with an ancient warning. Marcus hesitated, his hand tightening around the grip of his weapon. "You sure about this, Claire? We're talking about an abandoned house. It could be a trap, or worse, a wild animal. We need to be smart here." Claire wasn't so sure. She had the feeling that the dog knew more than it let on, and that's what scared her. They were trained to deal with people, with motives they could understand, but this was beyond their comprehension. "I know," Claire replied quietly, glancing at the dog. "But it's not just leading us in. It's protecting something, and I think it's trying to show us that something's wrong. It's not a random act." The dog stopped at the threshold, looking back at the agents as if waiting for them to catch up. Then, without another sound, it entered the house, disappearing into the shadows. The agents stood at the door, exchanging uncertain glances. The house loomed over them, dark and foreboding. Finally, Claire nodded and stepped forward. "We go in?" But we move fast. As they stepped inside, the smell hit them. Stale air, damp wood, and something else, something metallic, that made Claire's stomach turn. The house was dark, the only light coming from the faint rays of the sun filtering through broken windows. Dust and cobwebs clung to everything, the once grand architecture now decayed and forgotten. It was clear that no one had lived here for years, maybe even longer. The dog was nowhere to be seen, but Claire could feel its presence, its unseen eyes watching them from the darkness. It had led them this far. It wasn't about to let them turn back now. The agents moved cautiously, their footsteps echoing through the empty house. They kept their weapons drawn, ready for anything. They moved through the creaking halls, each room more unsettling than the last. There were no signs of recent human activity, but there were strange markings on the walls, scratches, symbols that looked like they had been carved into the wood with something sharp. The deeper they went into the house, the more the air seemed to thicken, pressing in on them, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for them to find something. Then in the back of the house they saw it. A door, slightly ajar. The faintest sliver of light spilled through the crack, casting an eerie glow on the floor. The dog had led them here, to this very spot. But why? Claire exchanged a glance with Marcus. His expression was unreadable, but she could see the same doubt in his eyes that she was feeling. What was behind that door? And more importantly, why did the dog want them to open it? It felt like they were standing on the edge of something huge, something that would change everything. And yet, neither of them dared to move closer to the door. But they knew they had no choice. To back away now would mean they'd never find out what the dog had led them to. "On three," Claire whispered, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of thoughts racing through her mind. "1, 2. Suddenly, the dog's growl cut through the tension, louder this time, fiercer. It was almost as if it was warning them, telling them to turn back before it was too late. But it was already too late. The door creaked open, revealing what lay beyond. The moment the door creaked open, the world seemed to freeze. The air, thick with tension, stood still. For a brief, heart-stopping second, the agents stood motionless, staring into the darkness beyond the threshold. There was someone waiting for them in the room. The faint light spilling through the crack in the door did little to dispel the overwhelming sense of dread that now gripped their hearts. Claire took a deep breath, willing herself to focus. There was no going back now. The dog had led them here for a reason. They had to know what it was. She motioned for the agents to move forward, but the air seemed to push against them, thickening with every step they took. Every creak of the floor beneath their boots echoed like a warning, a countdown to something unknown. But none of them were prepared for what they were about to find. As they entered the room, the first thing they noticed was the silence. The house had been eerily quiet since they'd stepped inside, but this room was different. It was as if the silence itself had weight. Heavy, suffocating. The floor was covered in dust, the air thick with the smell of mildew and decay. The walls were lined with strange, faded symbols, unfamiliar markings that seemed almost ritualistic. Their meaning was lost on Claire, but she could feel their significance in the pit of her stomach. The room was empty, save for an old wooden table in the center. A single candle burned, casting an unsteady glow across the room. The flame flickered as if it too was hesitant to burn in such a place. But it wasn't the candle that caught Claire's attention. It was the large object lying on the table. It was a book. Or rather, it resembled a book, but it was unlike anything Claire had ever seen. Its cover was made of some dark, weathered material that seemed to shimmer in the dim light. The pages, visible through the cracked cover, were old and yellowed, covered in more of those strange symbols. The air around it felt electric, charged with something otherworldly. Claire couldn't explain it, but she felt an immediate pull toward the book, like it was calling to her. Her eyes darted to Marcus, who stood frozen, his face pale. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. Claire didn't answer immediately. She didn't need to. The answer was already clear to her. This book was the key to whatever nightmare they had walked into. It was the center of the mystery. The dog had led them here, to this very room, because it wanted them to uncover the secret. But why? Before she could make a move, the dog's growl echoed through the room once again. The deep, guttural sound was enough to make her heart skip a beat. It wasn't a warning this time. It was something more urgent, more desperate. Claire's eyes shot to the corner of the room, where she saw the dog standing, its body tense and its ears perked up. It was looking at something, or someone, that Claire couldn't yet see. Then, the floorboards creaked behind her. Claire spun around, her heart hammering in her chest. There, standing in the doorway, was a figure. A man, tall and imposing, with wild, unkempt hair and dark eyes that seemed to glimmer with an unsettling knowledge. His gaze locked onto Claire, and for a moment, the world seemed to blur around them. There was something deeply wrong about him, an aura that sent a cold shiver crawling down her spine. "Who are you?" Claire demanded, trying to steady her breath. The man didn't answer immediately. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes never leaving hers. The tension in the room thickened, as if the very air had turned hostile. The dog's growl grew louder, its body stiffening as if ready to pounce. "You shouldn't have come," the man finally said, his voice low and gravelly, yet eerily calm. "You've awakened something you don't understand." Claire took a step back, her instincts screaming at her to be careful. But she couldn't retreat now, not after everything. The book, the dog, the strange man, they were all tied together. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they weren't making sense. "What is that book?" Marcus asked, his voice shaky but demanding. The man's lips twitched into what could only be described as a smile, but there was nothing reassuring about it. "That," he said, his eyes flickering to the table, "is a key to something much bigger than you could ever imagine." Claire's mind raced. A key to what? The man took another step closer, his gaze never wavering. To a door that was never meant to be opened. To a truth that has been buried for centuries. And now it's too late. The words hung in the air like a heavy fog, suffocating the room. Claire's stomach tightened. The man's presence was suffocating, as if he carried an entire world of secrets within him. Secrets that were now threatening to spill out. She glanced at Marcus, who looked just as confused and unsettled as she felt. "Who are you?" Claire pressed again, her voice stronger this time. The man took another step forward, his face growing darker. "My name doesn't matter. What matters is what you've unleashed by coming here. You've awoken something that was meant to remain forgotten." As he spoke, the air around them seemed to shift. The room grew colder, and Claire could feel a prickling sensation creeping up her spine. It was as if something ancient, something malevolent, was stirring, awakening from its long slumber. The dog, still standing by the corner, growled louder. Its body was trembling, as if it was struggling to contain some deeper instinct. The tension in the room reached a boiling point. The man's eyes glinted, and for the briefest moment, Claire thought she saw something flash behind them. Something dark, something alive. Without warning, the man moved toward the table, his hand reaching for the book. The dog let out a sudden, ear-splitting bark, and without thinking, Claire lunged forward, aiming to stop him. But before she could reach him, the air seemed to crackle with energy, and the room was filled with an overpowering roar. The walls shook, the floor trembled beneath their feet, and the ground seemed to open up beneath them. The last thing Claire saw before the world went black was the man's eyes, wide and filled with something that looked like both fear and triumph, as if he knew something she didn't, and she was about to find out the hard way. When the darkness swallowed them, Claire's world collapsed into an endless void. There was no light, no sound, just a deep, suffocating quiet that pressed in on her from all sides. Her heart pounded in her chest as she struggled to breathe, her mind racing to understand what had just happened. The last thing she remembered was the man reaching for the book, the air crackling, the ground shaking. Then nothing. Seconds, or maybe minutes, passed before she felt the sensation of solid ground beneath her feet. She gasped for air, her lungs burning as she tried to regain control of her breath. The oppressive silence still hung in the air, but now it was accompanied by a strange, unsettling hum. It vibrated through her bones, filling her with a sense of impending doom. She opened her eyes, blinking against the disorienting blackness. Gradually, shapes began to emerge from the void, blurry at first, but then slowly sharpening into focus. She was no longer in the house. She was somewhere else, somewhere wrong. The walls around her were dark, but not like the house. These walls seemed to ripple, as if they were alive, pulsing with a slow, steady rhythm. The floor beneath her feet felt slick and cold, like it wasn't meant to be walked on. Claire's mind raced. What is this place? The questions piled up, but the answers remained elusive. She wasn't alone, she realized. There was movement in the darkness. She could hear footsteps, faint at first, but then growing louder, closer. She tensed every muscle in her body, screaming for her to run, but there was nowhere to go. The strange humming continued, growing more intense, as if whatever was in this place was drawing nearer. Then she heard it, a low growl, unmistakable. The dog. But it wasn't just the sound of an animal anymore. It had a deeper, more menacing tone to it, a tone that made Claire's blood run cold. The growl reverberated through the air, bouncing off the walls in unnatural ways, as if the dog was not just here, but somehow everywhere. Before she could make sense of it, a figure emerged from the shadows. It was Marcus. He looked disoriented, his face pale, his eyes wide with fear. "Claire," he whispered, his voice shaking. "What is this place?" Claire could barely answer. The words caught in her throat. There were no answers. There was only the sense that they had crossed some invisible line, and now they were trapped in whatever nightmare this was. The man, the book, the dog, they had all led them here, but for what purpose? What had they awakened? Suddenly, a light flickered in the distance, dim but unmistakable. Claire's heart skipped a beat as she turned toward it, her instincts urging her to move. It wasn't much, but it was something. Maybe it was a way out. She started to move toward it, her legs trembling with each step, but the humming intensified, and the air grew heavier, thicker. It felt as though the very space around her was tightening, like the walls were closing in. "Claire, wait!" Marcus called from behind, his voice barely audible over the growing noise. But Claire didn't stop. She couldn't. The light was drawing her in, pulling her forward with an intensity she couldn't ignore. But as she got closer, the light shifted, twisting in an unnatural way. It flickered and warped, stretching out like fingers reaching for her, trying to grab her. Claire froze in place, a sense of terror creeping over her. This wasn't just a light. It was something else, something alive. Then, from the darkness, the growl came again, louder, more urgent. The dog's eyes appeared in the shadows, glowing faintly in the dim light. It wasn't the friendly animal that had led them here. This creature was different. Its eyes were filled with something primal, something almost otherworldly. And in that moment, Claire understood. The dog wasn't protecting them. It was warning them. Before she could react, the growl turned into a snarl, and the shadows around her began to twist. The walls pulsated, and a terrible, gut-wrenching sound filled the air, a sound like metal scraping against stone, the ground shuddering beneath her feet. She looked down, her breath catching in her throat. The floor was cracking, splitting open like a wound, revealing a deep, dark void beneath. "Claire!" Marcus shouted again, but his voice was lost in the chaos. He reached out to her, but the ground beneath him gave way, and he stumbled back. The light ahead of them flickered again, then dimmed, almost as if it were pulling away, retreating into the shadows. Claire's pulse quickened. Something was happening, something she couldn't control, and time was running out. Then, in a moment of terrifying clarity, she saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the light. The man. His eyes were dark, filled with a twisted kind of satisfaction. He was standing at the center of it all, watching them as everything around them unraveled. "You should have never come," he said, his voice echoing like a distant thunderclap. The walls trembled as the space around them warped, shifting like liquid. It was as if reality itself was breaking down, and Claire felt herself being pulled into it, her body weightless, her thoughts scattered. The man's figure flickered, his form distorting as though he were dissolving into the very air around them. And then, just as quickly as it had started, everything stopped. The growl of the dog faded into nothing, the hum of the place stilled. The air felt heavy, oppressive, as if a breath had been held for too long. For a moment, there was nothing, just an unbearable silence that seemed to stretch on forever. But then Claire heard it, the faintest whisper, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Run." The word was chilling in its simplicity. It was a command, a warning, a plea, and it was enough to snap Claire back to reality. But where could they run? How could they escape the horrors that had been unleashed? She didn't know, but she knew one thing for certain. Whatever happened next, there would be no turning back. Claire's heart raced in her chest as the word "run" echoed in her mind, repeating like a drumbeat. But where was there to run? The oppressive silence pressed against her, and the reality of their situation slammed into her. The man, no, the thing that looked like a man, was still watching them, his form flickering like a ghost, his presence suffocating the space. Then, without warning, the ground beneath her feet trembled again. But this time, it wasn't just the floor. The air itself seemed to distort, warping and twisting, as though the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. Claire staggered back, her eyes darting around, trying to make sense of the chaos. The walls seemed to stretch, bending in ways that were impossible, warping as though they were no longer solid. The edges of the room blurred, and the familiar sensations of the house, of the world she knew, faded away. It was as if they were no longer even in the same place. Or perhaps they were never meant to be here at all. Marcus grabbed her arm, his grip tight, his face pale and filled with terror. "What is happening? What the hell is this place?" She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Her mind was spinning, and all she could do was watch as the strange figure at the edge of the light began to move. His movements were slow, deliberate, like he was savoring every moment of their fear. The edges of his form seemed to bleed into the shadows around him, his features warping and shifting like liquid. It was as if he didn't belong in this world at all. And then, with a sudden, chilling clarity, it hit her. This wasn't just a room. This was a trap. The moment the thought entered her mind, the ground beneath them shattered. The world seemed to break open, splitting wide with a sound like thunder. And in that instant, everything around them fell away. Claire screamed as she was ripped from the floor, her body weightless as the air around her shifted violently. For a brief second, it felt like she was falling through nothingness, through endless space, but the pull of gravity never came. There was no sense of direction, no sense of up or down. The light, the strange, flickering light that had led them this far, was gone, replaced by an all-encompassing darkness. Marcus's voice was the only thing she could hear, but it was distant, warped. "Claire!" he shouted, but the sound of his voice faded as if he were sinking away into the abyss. The silence returned, but it was different now. It was heavier. It was suffocating. And then a whisper, soft at first, barely audible, but unmistakable. "You shouldn't have come." Claire whipped her head around, but there was no one there. The voice didn't belong to Marcus. It wasn't the man either. It was something else, something older, darker. She could feel it now, like a presence brushing against her skin, like invisible fingers grazing her body. Then with a jolt, she was back. The floor was solid beneath her again, and she gasped for air, her heart hammering in her chest. But when she opened her eyes, everything had changed. The room, the space, was no longer the same. The walls had shifted, become something unrecognizable. The very air around them had changed, thickened with a palpable, malevolent energy. She was still in the same place, but it was wrong. Nothing made sense anymore. And there, standing in the center of the room, was the dog. But it wasn't the same dog they had followed here. The creature's eyes glowed with an unnatural light, its fur bristling, the air around it charged with an ominous power. It was no longer an animal. It was something far more terrifying. The dog's gaze locked onto Claire, and for a moment, she thought she saw something else in its eyes. A memory, a recognition. The same dark energy that had clung to the man, that had filled the room before, seemed to be in the dog now. But it was more than that. It was as if the dog had changed too. Before Claire could process what was happening, a new sound filled the room. A low, echoing hum, like a vibration that was felt deep in the bones, making everything around them tremble. It started slowly, like the beginning of a storm, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it was deafening. And then the shadows moved. At first, it was just a flicker, a shift in the darkness that made Claire's skin crawl. But then it became more. The shadows twisted and writhed, forming shapes that were not human. They seemed to reach for her, to pull at her, their forms shifting like liquid darkness. The walls, the floor, the very air around her, all of it seemed to be alive now, as though the room itself had turned against her. The humming grew louder still, and Claire could feel the pressure building. The walls were closing in. The shadows were growing, expanding, swallowing the light, growing darker and more twisted with every passing second. Marcus was screaming now, his voice cracking with panic. But it wasn't just his fear that filled the air. There was something else now, something worse, a presence that clung to the air, that seemed to seep into their bones, weighing them down. The dog took a step forward, its glowing eyes burning into Claire. And in that moment, she understood. It wasn't the man who had led them here. It wasn't the book. It wasn't even the dog. It was the room itself. The space around them was alive, aware, feeding on their fear. It had drawn them here, manipulated them into awakening something that should never have been disturbed. The dog was no longer an ally. It was a sentinel, a guardian for something much darker, much older, and they had unwittingly walked right into its trap. The floor trembled again, but this time it wasn't the house shaking. It was something beneath them, something huge, something ancient that was stirring to life. The shadows twisted and recoiled, as though in fear of what was rising beneath them. Claire felt the unmistakable weight of dread, the kind that settled deep in her stomach and spread like poison. She had no idea what was coming, but she knew one thing with certainty. Whatever it was too late to stop it now. The room, the very world around them, was unraveling, and she was at the center of it. The final pieces of the puzzle were falling into place, and what they revealed was far worse than anything she could have imagined. The shadows continued to stretch and contort around Claire, pressing in on her from every direction. It felt like the walls themselves were closing in, suffocating her. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her pulse pounding in her ears. The dark energy was all-encompassing now, thick and oppressive, like the very air itself had become a living nightmare. Every instinct told her to run, but there was nowhere to go. There was no escape. Marcus was still behind her, shouting her name, but his voice was barely audible over the cacophony of the swirling darkness. She could see his silhouette, but the oppressive weight of the air made it feel as though he were miles away. She turned to him, her hand reaching out, but the darkness twisted the very space between them. He was slipping, falling through the cracks, his form flickering and blurring like a broken reflection in a shattered mirror. The dog had become something else entirely, no longer an animal, but a force of pure terror. Its eyes burned with an unnatural, almost malevolent intelligence. Claire could feel it watching her, its presence crawling under her skin. She had thought it had led them here to help, but it wasn't help they needed. It was something far more dangerous that they had awakened. And then, just as the weight of the darkness became unbearable, the world seemed to pause. For a fleeting moment, everything stilled. Claire felt a presence, something that wasn't the dog or the man, but something older, something that had been here long before them, something that had been waiting. The walls pulsed again, but this time it wasn't in a threatening way. It was almost like a heartbeat, steady and rhythmic. The air, heavy with dread, seemed to soften just for an instant, like a veil lifting. She didn't understand it, but in that moment, she knew what she had to do. With a surge of desperation, Claire stepped forward. She pushed through the thick, suffocating air, ignoring the growls that reverberated around her. The dark, twisting shadows recoiled at her movement, as if they feared her. The dog's eyes followed her, burning with an intensity that sent shivers down her spine. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. She reached out, her hand trembling as she touched the wall in front of her. The surface was cold, slick, but as her fingers brushed against it, something strange happened. The darkness shuddered, and for the first time, the room felt like it was reacting to her, not the other way around. The shadows pulled back, revealing glimpses of light. Faint, but undeniable. The dog let out a low growl, but this time it wasn't a warning. It was something else. The creature stepped back, its glowing eyes narrowing, as if unsure of what Claire was doing. The pressure in the air lessened, the suffocating weight lifting slightly. It was as though the darkness, the thing that had controlled this place, was hesitating, as if it had never expected her to fight back. Marcus, too, seemed to snap out of his dazed state, his eyes locking onto Claire. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice strained with confusion and fear. I think I know how to stop it," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper, but the determination in her eyes was clear. She wasn't sure how or why, but something had clicked. A deeper understanding had taken root within her. The presence she had felt, the one that wasn't the dog or the man, it was like a distant echo of the house itself, of the place they had walked into, and it was willing to listen. Claire pressed harder against the wall, feeling the vibrations beneath her hand. Slowly, steadily, the room began to change. The oppressive air lightened. The shadows writhed and pulled away from her, retreating into the corners, where they faded into the darkness. The walls began to shift again, but this time in the opposite direction, stretching outward, away from her, as though the room was giving her space. The dog barked once, sharp and harsh, but then fell silent. Its eyes flickered between Claire and the shifting space around them, its glowing gaze now tinged with something almost like hesitation. "Claire," Marcus's voice was trembling, but she could hear the faint note of hope in it. Is it over?" She didn't answer right away. The darkness wasn't completely gone. The shadows still lingered, but they no longer felt threatening. They seemed subdued, as if their power had waned. The space around them was shifting, breathing, but it was no longer hostile. It was as if the balance had been restored, the forces that had been manipulating the room losing their grip. The man, if he could still be called that, had disappeared, vanishing into the void as if he had never been there at all. The book that had set everything in motion was gone, leaving no trace of its presence. It was as though it had never existed, or perhaps it had never needed to. And the dog, once a menacing force of darkness, now sat quietly on the floor, its glowing eyes softening. It wasn't the same creature they had first encountered. It was calmer now, as if it had been freed from the dark influence that had controlled it. Slowly, almost warily, it approached Claire, sniffing her hand before nudging it with its head, as though acknowledging her presence. She stepped back, her heart still racing, unsure of what to make of the creature now. But there was no fear in its eyes, no malice, just a quiet understanding. "It's over," Claire said softly, more to herself than to Marcus. She could feel the shift in the air, the way the space had settled around them. It wasn't perfect. There were still traces of the dark energy, remnants of the forces they had encountered. But the danger had passed. Marcus looked around, taking in the now-changed room. "We actually did it?" Claire nodded slowly, her mind still processing everything. They had come so close to losing themselves to whatever force had controlled this place. But they had fought back, and they had won. As they stood there, in the quiet aftermath of everything that had happened, Claire's thoughts turned to the future. What would happen now? Would they ever understand what had truly occurred? What had been the true nature of the forces that had almost consumed them? But as she glanced at Marcus, then at the dog, she realized something important. Not every question needed to be answered. Sometimes the journey, no matter how terrifying or uncertain, was enough.